When Vladimir Putin launched his Ukraine invasion, he thought he had all the time in the world to complete it. Not that Russia would need it, of course. Ukraine would fall in a week, Putin thought, but it didn't. Russia would be fine though. With such a massive military and more equipment than Ukraine could ever hope to muster, the smash-and-grab special operation would turn into a war of attrition that Russia could win. It hasn't won, and after nearly 4 years, the quagmire that Putin created has left Russia in a terrible situation. Putin is running out of time if he wants to win in Ukraine, as the Russian strategy collapses around him. That's according to Nigel Gould-Davis, who recently sat down for a discussion with Dominic Prazel, where the two discussed a recent article written by Davis. That article suggests that time is no longer on Putin's side due to 3 key issues, all of which have combined to force Putin into accelerating the Russian strategy to the point where his country is now in danger. Davis, who is a senior research fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and once served as UK's ambassador to Belarus, starts off by saying that the Russian time crunch isn't necessarily solely down to Putin's strategy or Ukraine's defense. Other players have dictated how the Ukraine war goes, and those other players are helping to put Russia in the position in which it finds itself. Davis encourages people to think back all the way to March 2022. At that point, it had become pretty clear that Putin had failed in his initial effort to capture Ukraine. The invasion, launched at the end of February, was meant to be done and dusted by March. As Business Insider reported in March 2022, Putin, or at least his advisors and propagandists, believed that Russia would take Ukraine in as little as 2 days. When that didn't happen, the floodgates were opened for external players to enter the conflict. It's been clear from that point on that the war will be decided as much as anything, not only by the fortunes and inherent capacities of the two combatants, Ukraine and Russia, but by the willingness and ability of other states, belligerents contributing to the war effort, Davis tells Prazel. Of course, the collective West was the first to step up. Since January 24, 2022, the US and Europe have combined to provide or pledge €392.15 billion to Ukraine, which amounts to around $450 billion. That's per the Kiel Institute Ukraine funding tracker, and it's notable that these numbers don't include countries like the UK, Canada, Japan, and others outside of the major donors that have also collectively sent billions of dollars to Ukraine. Support hasn't been in short supply for Ukraine, and that support has played a huge role in ensuring the conflict has stretched on for as long as it has. Initially, Russia's failure to take Ukraine in a flash led to the question of how long and to what extent the West would support Ukraine, Davis points out. We have that answer, as support is ongoing. With the war lasting so long, Russia was then forced to call on external supporters of its own. China, North Korea, and Iran have all helped Russia in one way or another. The latter two have provided weapons, ranging from artillery shells to drones. China helps in subtler ways, such as selling dual-use components and buying massive quantities of Russian oil. What these nations provide to Russia is almost less important than the fact that Russia is relying on external parties to keep its war effort going, and that is what has really damaged Russia when it comes to its long-term strategy. If we therefore frame the dynamics of the war in terms of the willingness and ability of other countries to contribute to the war effort, Davis tells Prazel, I think that puts into clarifying perspective some important developments which have taken place in the last few months, almost all of which are harmful to Russia's long-term prospects. There are 3 of these developments to combine to put Russia on a timeline in Ukraine. The first might well be the most devastating. Putin has failed to make effective use of Donald Trump's becoming president of the United States. This was a great opportunity, Davis says, and Putin had spent much of 2023 waiting for the return of Trump. It's obvious why, after we've seen the roller coaster of events that have unfolded in 2025 since Trump returned to the White House. Davis suggests that Trump saw the Ukraine war more from Russia's point of view than Ukraine's when he first entered office, leading to great fear in the West the US would abandon Ukraine altogether. And for a while, it seemed that Putin's manipulations were going to win the day. The first quarter of 2025 saw Trump hold a volatile White House meeting with Zelensky that would have gone down a treat in Russia. In early March, the US suspended military intelligence sharing with Ukraine, which followed a suspension of military aid. Both would be resumed shortly thereafter. But when Trump started blaming Zelensky and Ukraine for starting the war with Russia in April, it seemed for all the world that Putin had Trump on his side. It would only be a matter of time before the US pulled away from Ukraine altogether. And without one of its largest supporters, Ukraine's downfall might well have happened. However, Putin seemed so confident that he had Trump on his side that he started to overplay his hand as we entered the second half of 2025. For now, we're in a moment where Trump's theory of peace has changed from one that required pressure to be put on Ukraine to compromise to a theory of peace through constraining and pressuring Russia, Davis tells Prazel. That's the last thing that Putin wanted, and other outlets have gone so far as to claim that Trump has turned his back on Putin. CNN was among them back in July, noting that Trump had started to berate Putin publicly, likely out of frustration over the fact that Putin was doing little more than giving lip service to the idea of announcing a ceasefire or signing a peace treaty with Ukraine. Putin had messed Trump around too much, and the US president was becoming openly hostile toward Russia. Though things between Putin and Trump had the potential to be mended when the Russian president visited Alaska for a summit, the relationship between the pair has deteriorated again since then. Putin gave yet more false promises of wanting peace. Again, he went back on them. By October, the BBC was reporting on how Trump had decided that pressure on Putin was the only way to bring the war to an end. The many carrots dangled in front of the Russian leader's face had failed to yield bites, so Trump was instead turning to the stick by threatening sanctions against Russia and even suggesting that the US would start providing Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Putin has failed, Davis declares. It's a diplomacy that's not merely inflexible but remarkably inept. He has failed to use the clear and obvious opportunity, hasn't even really tried to give Trump an excuse to continue engaging constructively with Russia, Davis adds. All of this leads to Trump being frustrated with Putin, and that frustration solidifies something that Putin believed he could get taken away: America's support for Ukraine. Part 1 of Putin's strategy for keeping the war in Ukraine going for as long as he needed has failed. The US isn't withdrawing, and the pressure Trump might have once placed on Zelensky now falls squarely on Putin's shoulders. Russia has completely mismanaged the biggest external player in the Ukraine war. That brings us to the second issue Davis notes, which is placing even more of a time crunch on Putin to achieve the victory in Ukraine that has eluded him since February 2022. This is an issue that is only just barely less important than Putin's mismanagement of the Trump situation, and it will have rattled Russia like a shotgun blast right to the gut. NATO members have committed to a massive increase in their defense spend. An increase to 5% of their gross domestic products, or GDP to be more precise. Bear in mind that NATO's recommendation for defense spending before Russia invaded Ukraine was 2%. Most of the organization's members didn't even spend that much. As the Atlantic Council says, just 6 NATO members hit or exceeded the 2% target in 2021, compared to 23 that were hitting it by mid-2024. Now those NATO members are going to shoot for 5% of GDP spending on defense. Trump is happy about that outcome. He'd been complaining about how the rest of NATO wasn't paying its way and relied too much on the US during his first term as president. Putin would have seen those complaints as a potential lever he could use to distance Trump, and thus the US, from its NATO allies. Instead, NATO ended up essentially agreeing with Trump while recognizing the growing threat that Russia presents. The group's members are going to be spending more than ever, and that is terrible news for Putin. After all, it's not just that NATO's European members are going to be spending more on their defense. It's that they have more to spend than Russia could ever hope to generate. Collectively, NATO's European members have much more money to spend than Putin can muster, even in Russia's best years. Europe has a collective GDP that is 10 times that of Russia, and if Europe committed just 0.2% of that GDP to Ukraine, it would be enough to bridge the financial gaps between Russia and Ukraine, according to the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Davis outlines what this means for Putin. Even a small increase in GDP devoted to defense would result in a vast superiority in material defense capabilities, Davis says of NATO's European members. Even if European member states in NATO got to 3% or 3.5%, that's something that Russia could not possibly match. What we see here isn't necessarily an issue that has a huge impact on Russia inside Ukraine. Putin's failed strategy in Ukraine has resulted in something far bigger than he anticipated. Europe has woken up to the Russian threat. And it's realized that having so much more money than Russia places it in a powerful position. A slow onrushing tsunami of defense capability for Europe's own defense is heading Russia's way, Davis says. And the only thing that Russia has to hold over Europe's NATO members is Russia's nuclear superiority. The nuclear gap could still present a problem, and that gap is massive. France and the UK are the only European members of NATO that have nuclear warheads. The Arms Control Association says that they have 515 between them. Russia has more than 10 times that amount, and it could try to use this nuclear gap to create pressure. But that's where the US comes back into play. It almost matches Russia in nuclear capability with 5,225 nukes to Russia's 5,580. Any attempt by Russia to use nuclear leverage on European NATO members will be met by a stern US reminder that it has nukes as well. The point is that Putin's strategy has ended up making Europe much stronger. Combine that with the Russian leader's failure to sway Trump, and you get 2 key issues that are putting pressure on Putin to find an end to the Ukraine war in any way that he can, other than the peace that everybody is pushing him to declare. With that, we come to the third thing that Davis notes is piling even more pressure onto Putin: growing strains inside Russia. As much as the Kremlin might want to portray the Russian people as being fully behind their president, even as hundreds of thousands of their soldiers die in Ukraine, the reality is that the average Russian is struggling. The battering that Russia's economy is taking as a result of the Ukraine invasion is starting to be felt all across the country, and that's as bad for Putin as the issues Russia now has with the US and Europe. Look within Russia at the growing strains that this combination of major war and severe sanctions are imposing on the Russian economy, Davis notes. I would say that we are entering a period now where the future will clearly be worse than the present or the past as current Russia's economy goes, and there are growing strains and tensions and distortions, and these are producing quiet signs of anxiety among parts of Russia's elites. That's a group that Putin doesn't want to anger. Russia's elites could be the key to turning the rest of the population against him, especially if they band together because they're losing money due to Putin's war. Russia's economic situation certainly looks bleak. As DW reported in September, Russia is dealing with stalled growth, massive declines in its energy revenue, and a budget deficit. None of these issues is being made any better by Western sanctions and Ukraine's strategy of repeatedly striking Russian oil refineries. Russia has already raised its value-added tax to 22% from its previous 20%, showcasing Putin's willingness to pass off the cost of the war he started to his own people. Russia has a budget deficit of around $50 billion, DW says, and the consequences are already clear to see. Public services from education to healthcare are receiving budget cuts to keep the war going. None of this means that Russia's people are on the verge of outright rebellion. Both Davis and Praisel point this out, with the latter playing devil's advocate to Davis's argument. Russia also has a low debt-to-GDP ratio, which works in Putin's favor. However, the fact remains that Russia's financial situation was much better before the launch of the Ukraine invasion than it is right now, and the longer the war goes on, the more money Putin spends, all to the Russian population's detriment. Think of this third issue as a slow-burning deadline. If Russia runs out of money or Putin deprives the country's elite or its people of so much that they end up rebelling, then it's game over for Russia. Putin's attritional strategy will have worked. It would have just taken him out instead of Ukraine. Russia's president is very aware of the many missteps and failures that have led to this trio of issues, and his response to everything that now afflicts Russia is very telling. As Davis notes, Russia has been getting more aggressive in recent months because it knows it's working to a deadline that was never meant to be a factor. We see this in Russia's recent drone incursions into European airspace. Since September, Russia has engaged in a constant campaign of sending drones and other aerial assets into the territory of NATO's European members. Most recently, Russian drone fragments have been found deep in Romania, The Independent reported on November 11th. Poland was the most prominent victim of Russia's evolution of its hybrid warfare strategy, as it dealt with an incursion of about 20 Russian drones in early September. Both Poland and Romania are building new defenses to deal with these incursions, the outlet adds. These drone tactics are an attempt by Putin to project power. He wants to intimidate NATO's European members by showing them that Russia's drones can reach them no matter how far away they may be. Instead, this escalation is starting to look like desperation from the Russian camp. Beyond this escalation, Russia has also been hitting Ukraine's energy infrastructure hard as the country moves into its difficult winter months. These attacks aren't new, as Davis points out, but they're powerful enough to really start putting the squeeze on Ukraine. On October 21st, the Kyiv Independent reported that these energy sector strikes had intensified as the prospect of Ukraine receiving Tomahawk missiles from the US dwindled. Putin may have thought that Ukraine would have no way of responding, and he's been sending drones and missiles in waves to hit Ukrainian energy. On November 9th, The Guardian noted that these energy infrastructure attacks have been effective enough to reduce Ukraine's generating capacity to zero. Now many of the country's citizens are facing blackouts that can last as long as 16 hours. While Putin is getting what he wants from these strikes, it's also clear why he's ramped them up so much. It's all about the time pressure his own strategy has placed him under. Putin is desperate to show the West that Ukraine is crumbling. With that showcase of Russian power comes leverage that Putin hopes he can use to negotiate the type of uncompromising peace that he wants. However, as we've already established, Trump has turned his back on Putin, and Europe is strengthening itself and Ukraine through higher spending. Putin's Hail Mary throw at Ukraine's energy infrastructure truly is a last-gasp attempt to assert Russia's dominance. If that throw fails, Russia may lose the war, at least in the sense of it being immune to Western pressure. It's no coincidence that the nuclear threats are starting to emerge from Russia once again. On November 5th, the Kyiv Independent reported on comments made by the country's defense minister Andrei Belousov. Responding to news that the US is working on the modernization of its nuclear arsenal, Belousov said, "The US is engaged in the accelerated modernization of its strategic offensive weapons. I believe it's advisable to begin preparations immediately." Russia tends to start talking about nuclear weapons when it knows that it's on the back foot. The acceleration of the country's strategy, both in terms of the hybrid war being waged on Europe and the more intense strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, isn't a sign of Putin's strength. Accelerating is indicative of Putin's desperation. Russia's leader became so out of touch because of his single-minded focus on Ukraine that he led his country into a corner. Russia has to win in Ukraine, and it has to do it quickly. Putin is running out of time, and there may be little he can do about it. There is this sense of a window of opportunity for Russia slowly beginning to close if things don't change, Davis notes. So Russia therefore needs to accelerate the ways it's implementing its theories of victory, which is to grind down Ukraine materially and militarily, and to outlast and divide and intimidate the West politically. If the window slams shut, Putin is done for. And who knows, he might end up finding himself the victim of an unfortunate fall from that window if he's not able to accomplish his goals in time. The pressure on Putin isn't just coming from the three issues that Davis discusses. Inside Russia, Putin is dealing with a shortage of the one thing that is vital to making the police state that he has created work. Something big is breaking in Russia, and Putin can't hide it anymore. Find out what in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the potential downfall of Putin thanks to his own Ukraine war strategy. And thanks for watching.